So we have gathered together this Christmas morning with joy in our hearts. And this is only fitting because joy is the theme for this day of our Advent series. And it's also that feeling that arises in us when we welcome that newborn Christ in our lives. So I say to you this morning with joy, Merry Christmas. So Christmas truly is a day of joy. I can remember the excitement as a child and awakening on Christmas morning and then opening presents and that had somehow multiplied underneath the Christmas tree. And it was a magical time. And then when I was a parent, I got to watch my own children experience that magic of Christmas morning and the wonder of the presents and the excitement and paper strewn everywhere. And I realized that the act of giving and receiving connects me to a joy that touches on the deeper meaning of Christmas, the birth of the Christ. So we in Unity celebrate Jesus as a Son of God who fully represented and expressed that divine Christ nature. And Unity also claims that each one of us has that same potential of the Christ within us that was in Jesus. And that if we are willing to believe that the birth of the Christ child was not just a one-time event 2,000 years ago, and if we are willing to accept that we too are spiritual beings, made in the image of divine love, then we can claim the Christmas story as our story. Now, the Bible scholar in me appreciates that each of the four gospel writers had both a common purpose in telling the story of Jesus the Christ, and each had a different understanding of what that meant and what was important to share. Each of them had a different perspective. The writer of the Gospel of Mark ignores the birth story entirely and begins with the baptism of Jesus in the Jordan River by John the Baptist. The writer of Matthew, that gospel focuses on the ancestral lineage of Jesus from the ancient ancestor of the Jewish nation, Abraham, all the way to King David and down to Joseph, the husband of Mary. This writer also tells the story of the three wise men who saw a star in a far-off land to the east and traveled to find what that baby that was to be the king of the Jews that the star foretold. And it is in the telling of that story that they interact with the present King Herod so that Joseph and Mary and the child Jesus then have to flee and hide in Egypt for a number of years until Herod dies. The writer of the Gospel of Luke has an extensive birth story narrative. And it's filled with many signs and divine visitations that foretell the importance of this birth and of this particular child. And it is this writer that tells and writes of the birth in the words that we probably most often remember. This is from Luke 2:7. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. End quote. This is the image that is probably embedded in all of our heads. A stable filled with animals and even shepherds, and Mary and Joseph watching a baby asleep in a straw-filled manger. Yes? And if you have been part of Unity for any period of time, you have probably had this story told to you metaphysically through that lens by which we read these kind of things in the Bible. Excuse me. The animals in the stable being aspects of our own physical nature. The shepherds and the sheep being our developing spiritual ideas and the guidance of principle that nurtures those ideas. Mary being our soul and that power of divine love in us. And Joseph being the intellect and the power of wisdom. And then the Christ child, of course, the baby, being the Christ Spirit in us, our God-given divine nature. So I want to stop here for a second and note that the birth of the Christ in our awareness is like a baby. It is in the beginning potential. It is only after we nurture it, only after time of learning and growing, that that potential becomes in us the miracle-capable Son of God. This is true in the Gospels. It is also true in us. So I want to return to this passage that I read. She laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. So I have this picture of Mary and Joseph going from inn to inn to inn, being turned away because all of them are overcrowded. And in fact, as I was contemplating this image, I connected with the innkeeper, and I heard a story that I want to share. If I wasn't making money hand over fist, I would have cursed Caesar. Bethlehem was swarming with people who had to be there for the census, and most of them were very unhappy, which made my job even more difficult. By the middle of the week, I was putting 2 guests per bed. By the Sabbath, it was 3, even if they were strangers. I even rented my own bed and took to sleeping in the stable beside the milk cow. Guest after guest would come to the inn, knocking on the door, asking for lodging, and I had to go to the door and turn them away, saying, "The inn is full, I have no more room." It was all a crippled old innkeeper could do. Just put his crutch under his arm, see to the housing of the guests, oversee the cooking, making sure that the staff serve the food and the wine, stop the fights, and then stable the animals. But, like I said, the money was good. A knock on the door. I clumped over to the door and throw it open to say once again the mantra, "The inn is full, there is no room," and found I could not talk. Oh, I tried, but no words would come out. There was a young couple. He was rather tall, and I could tell he was not too prosperous. She was a young thing. And sitting on that donkey, I thought that she might birth that child right there on my doorstep. But her face there was a stillness in her face that stopped my words. And I don't quite even believe to this day what happened next. I found myself apologizing that there was no room for them. And then I found myself saying that I was sleeping in the stable, and it wasn't much, but the straw was clean, and it was out of the wind, and they were welcome to stay there with me if they would like. And when he nodded, I walked back and showed them the stable. Well, it was more of a hollow in the hillside, not even a cave, really, but they seemed grateful. It was later that night, after most of the guests had gone to the bed and I had sat down by the fire, put my foot up, trying to ease the pain, when there was another knock on the door. And I went to throw it open to shout my mantra again when the wonder began. I opened that door, and the courtyard was as bright as if the sun was well up in the sky. And there were a whole group of shepherds, and they were shouting, and they were pointing upwards, and they were saying something about angels. Now, I never saw an angel, but there was the brightest star I have ever seen, and it seemed to hang just over the inn. And then this big burly man grabbed my arm and he asked me if a child had been born. And I started to say how ridiculous. And I remembered the kids. And so I hobbled back to the stable. Of course, the shepherds followed me. And as I went in, I realized that that young girl had become a mother. And I heard this soft murmuring. And the shepherds crowded in behind me, and so I went to the corner and I grabbed my milk stool and I sat down. And I listened. That evening, I heard stories that you would say were miracles. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I awoke in the pre-dawn light, cold, stiff, and already late to start my day. So I hurried to the inn, found the cook already at work and the guests starting to rouse. So it wasn't until after breakfast and the cleanup that I was able to go back and check on my young family. They were well. And the babe, well, I thought that babe was exceptional. It was years later that somebody told me that that baby grew up to be a teacher and a healer. And I was not surprised. You see, it was almost noon of that day before I realized that I had left my crutch lying on the stable floor. And I never needed to go back to pick it up. You see, I was the first one that he healed. And I hope that you too find the joy of healing in your life. Shalom. So, that story, as it came to me, tells me that Christmas is also a time for healing. For do we not have many opportunities to collect hurts, both physical and emotional, as we live these human lives of ours? The blessing of Christmas is part of knowing that that divine healer is born in us, if we will have it so. This idea of the divine born in me is the focus of the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John. It focuses on a spiritual birth. And I want to read John 1 through 5 and 14. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. And all things came into being through him, and without him was not one thing made. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. This gospel writer tells of the divine nature of Jesus, and by extension, our own divine nature. And like all babies, our divine nature needs to be nurtured and developed. And that's our work, both collectively and individually. So in the new year, I'll be teaching a class based on Gary Simmons' book, Eye of the Storm. And I'm teaching this class as an entry into some of the developmental work of inner growth. And I do hope that you will join me. But now is Christmas, and a time for joyous celebration as we connect today to the Christmases of our past. So I remember when I was in grade school, and I lived in Glenwood, Iowa. My father was a Disciples of Christ minister, and often after the Christmas Eve service, which I have to honestly say I have no remembrance of at all, we would pack our presents and our clothes and get into the car, and my mother and my father and us four boys would drive all night down to Poto, Oklahoma. And we would arrive about 4 o'clock in the morning to the home of my mother's parents. So after we arrived at my grandparents' house, we would often be put to bed for a few hours before Christmas would start. And then the excitement of opening presents and stockings to empty and sweets to eat. And it never failed that no matter when we left or how late we got there, that Santa Claus would always bring the presents to the right house. I mean, Christmas was a magical time. And when I look back at those experiences, I realize that Christmas for me was not about the presents or even the adventure or the magic of the season. It is the people that I was with. Family that I loved unconditionally. For me, Christmas is connecting to people and loving them without holding anything back. This is how Christmas plays out for me. I want to see the Christ child within me, seeing through my eyes, loving through my heart, so that every person I meet, every day of my life becomes as precious and as worthy and as loved as were those people of my childhood. So may this Christmas, may all of us see with the eyes of our inner Christ. May we love with the heart of our inner Christ. And may each breath we take, we become one with the joy and the peace of divine love as we are healed. Namaste.